Thank you, Doctor. We have gathered a group of experts today who will shed light on the vast subject that we're focusing on. We're focusing on three themes, as you can see in our program. One is the science and Islam on methodology, and the second is science and Islam on the subject of evolution, and the third is science and Islam on the subject of myth and miracle. Can science and Islam coexist? And if yes, can they be compatible? How can we have Muslim children enter science classrooms without creating a conflict between their faith and their cognitive abilities? When religion and science both have answers, which one has precedence? What does science take away from religion? And what does science give to religion? And what does religion take away from science? And not what does religion give to science? These questions and more we hope that we will be addressing throughout our talks and panel discussions. I will have the pleasure now of introducing my friend Sohail Ahmad. Sohail is an activist in the ex-Muslim space. He holds a Bachelor of Applied Science in Systems Design Engineering with an honors in economics. In his capacity as an activist, Sohail is engaged in both community organizing and public outreach. He has been a Toronto chapter lead for both Muslimish and the ex-Muslims of North America, while also engaging in online activism under the alias Reason on Faith. His public activism has a simple mission: to challenge the theological underpinnings of Islam, most often through the lens of modernist apologetics, such as those coming from movements like the Ahmadiyya, into which he was born. To that end, Sohail released his inaugural YouTube video in May of 2019, where he came out publicly and for the very first time. It's a 2.5-hour documentary-style presentation touching upon why he left theological problems with Islam and where we might go from here. He's going to be talking today about the question of the coexistence as regards science and Islam, or of science and any other religion for that matter, has always come down to how we define terms, something that is both obvious and subtle. Of course, this question has been raised before, it's also been answered before, yet the answers have been and will continue to be all over the map. In this talk, Sohail Ahmad unpacks the science and Islam question by defining terms to illustrate how our presuppositions can and do yield vastly different answers to this age-old question, focusing on the terms and terminology. I'll introduce to you Sohail Ahmad.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Allow me a moment to get set up. So as Wissam provided in the introduction, I'm here to talk to you about the implicit assumptions that come with the question underlying the title of this conference: can Islam and science coexist? And when we ask this question, we're actually asking a special case of a more broader question about can religion and science coexist? So, For a moment, though, I'd like to just cut through all of the academic abstractions, and just for a moment, and take us to a very human place. Those of us who are exploring Islam, whether coming from a Muslim background or from outside, are often seeking to assess the truth claims of the religion by exploring questions just like this one. For if a religious scripture claims to be coming from an all-knowing, all-powerful deity, and it doesn't concord with basic scientific truths, then the whole enterprise of investing our personal energies into such a religious belief system can seem futile. It can seem downright delusional. And I'd argue that while many religious practices can and do enrich our lives, we nonetheless do humanity a disservice by perpetuating what might fundamentally be untrue. To put it another way, we're ultimately asking, is Islam true, or have we been sold a false bill of goods? And the science and religion question is one of the ways that indirectly we are seeking to address that fundamental question. So now, returning to this question with a bit more rigor, I wanted to point out that many of us will come to the question, can Islam and science coexist, with different presuppositions and different definitions. In this talk, I'm going to outline how we might be talking past one another and how that can lead to answers, different answers, to this rather pivotal question. I'll then follow up with an exploration of the apologetics, which claim that the Quran contains descriptions of the natural world, impossible for humans of the 7th century to have known, save for divine revelation vouchsafed to a prophet by an all-knowing, all-powerful deity, Allah in this case. It's a paradigm I've personally encountered as I've engaged with apologetics from a minority, modernist and missionary group, that of the Ahmadiyya Muslims, the community in which I was born. The apologetics that I'll take you through, though, are increasingly being echoed by progressive and modernist Muslims in the West. And that's happening generally, so it's not just fringe small groups that are approaching things this way. All right, so just for some background, and in the previous talk, you got some more rigorous definitions, so I'm just going to do a cursory pass through this. But the definitions you see on the screen here now for science, Islam, and coexistence are from the Oxford American English Dictionary. And they just touch the surface, but I'll read the one for science. Knowledge about the structure and behavior of the natural and physical world based on facts that you can prove, for example, by experiments. And for Islam, the Muslim religion, based on belief in one God and revealed through Muhammad as the prophet of Allah. Coexist. To exist together in the same place or at the same time, especially in a peaceful way. I'd argue that two entities can coexist rather begrudgingly, but that true coexistence is harmonious, as hinted by the phrase in the definition, in a peaceful way. I suspect that most of us had come to this conference having read the title and did a subconscious substitution of no conflict or not conflict for the word coexist. And that raises a much more interesting question. This coexist versus conflict question. And that's something actually later today Ali Rizvi will be unpacking in his talk, so I'll leave that here. For my own talk, I will simply take the position, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A section, that coexistence, true coexistence, requires an absence of conflict. So let's now shift to the word Islam. What is Islam to you? Is Islam what the Quran says, or is Islam what Muslims do? Or is it some third or fourth definition that maybe we'll unpack in a Q&A? If we're opting for the scriptural approach to provide a definition for Islam, would that include the vast body of hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad? Or perhaps just a subset of those sayings found in Sahih or authenticated compilations? I'd argue that using what Muslims do as a proxy for what Islam is, and the engagement of Muslims in scientific careers as telegraphing coexistence, is both superficial and uninteresting. We have devoutly religious Muslims in both the East and the West, deeply infused in scientific disciplines already. Dr. Abdus Salam, as featured in the recent Netflix documentary Salam, was both a religious Ahmadi Muslim and a Nobel Prize-winning particle physicist. So the coexistence is already here. I'd argue, however, that Islam is not what Muslims do, but that it's what the religion itself contains, the scripture. Muslims can be better or worse than the teachings found within their scriptures. They can be dutifully compliant to the doctrines of their faith, or selective cultural embodiments of nothing more than a nominal label. So, if we want to get rigorous, we need to go where things are codified. We need to go where statements and claims reside. We need to go no further than the Quran itself. There is, after all, no more sanctified a document in Islam than the Quran. As such, we can get closer to a meaningful answer to the question of this conference if we now rephrase our question. Can the Quran and science coexist? Or better yet, employing the more meaningful steelman of avoid conflict for coexist, can the Quran and science avoid conflict? Finally, let's just paraphrase this question to a clearer and more direct question at the heart of the matter. Is there a conflict between the Quran and science? Most Muslim apologists will say, no, there's no conflict. While many of us who are non-believers, including former believers like myself, claim that indeed there is a conflict here. Yes, it's true that the Quran repeatedly asks readers to ponder the natural world. And if we go beyond the Quran, there are numerous statements attributed to Prophet Muhammad that encourage the seeking of knowledge. But seeking knowledge is not the same as making statements about the real world as deemed coming from the infallible creator of the universe. As for science, in a nutshell, it's about the real world. And to be sure, science does not make a claim for itself regarding absolute certainty. And again, this was covered well in the previous talk on methodology. However, we do have an extremely high degree of confidence in the physics of gravity and fluid mechanics, at least at the classical Newtonian scale. We do have a fair degree of confidence regarding the general limitations for complex and nuanced interspecies communication, say, between human beings and ants, or between human beings and birds. The lack of absolute certainty espoused with humility by science in no way opens up the door for religious tradition or scripture to suggest that human beings like Jesus might have been physically hoisted off into the heavens, or that Solomon could understand the speech of ants and birds. Science tells us and this is not even contested, nor contestable, that such examples haven't been demonstrated, ever, as even being possible. As such, we are justified in taking such statements as fiction, as fairy tale. They simply have no connection to reality. Our natural skepticism is doubly justified by the absence of such fantastical phenomena in our modern world today. For example, for much of Islam's early history, and even today, Orthodox Muslims read descriptions of miracles in the Quran performed by Jesus and that of Solomon and take it at face value. The same people might then turn around and state that the Quran also contains scientific foreknowledge. Modern apologetics seek to rescue the Quran from the charge of containing fables by asserting that such passages are all metaphor, and they just happen to have been misunderstood by most Muslims for most of Islam's history. They were metaphor all along. So, I want to take you through an example. This is a verse from the Quran where it talks about Solomon understanding the speech of ants. And gathered for Solomon were his soldiers of the jinn and men and birds, and they were marching in rows, until when they came upon the valley of the ants, an ant said, "O ants, enter your dwellings, that you not be crushed by Solomon and his soldiers, while they perceive not." So we've got interspecies communication. In the next verse, which I don't have here, Solomon is pleased at hearing this. The ant leader here obviously has a understanding that soldiers are coming. They belong to Solomon, and the soldiers might crush them, but not actually perceive it. Now think about this. For most of Islam's history, you'll find most Muslims, including scholars, doubling down on this at face value. But in the last 100 years or so, you hear more and more of an echo of people saying, well, maybe this was just, metaphor. And in fact, the community from which I was raised, which tried to espouse no discord between science and scripture, they would reject the supernatural. And so they would say this is all metaphor. In their translation, the Arabic word namal for ant, they would espouse or assert that this is actually just the name of people who are taking on a tribal name that has an animal name. So now this is a different paradigm altogether. And they said, this is actually the meaning. So namal wasn't an ant. It was, and the Numlite are people who just take on an animal name, sort of like a sports team that might take on the name the Bobcats. Or you have tribes, like the Bani Asad, the lions. So they're taking this approach. But what's interesting is, even if you try to take that metaphorical approach here, you run into a problem. How is it that human beings, seeing an army coming, are afraid that that army is going to crush them, not even perceiving that they're crushing other human beings? Remember, they're not rolling in with Abrams tanks or dropping fighter jet bombs. These are humans marching, maybe on horseback. Are they going to crush other human beings without knowing? And so even some of these approaches with metaphor, they fall short, and they actually give credence that the original early Islamic scholars and Muslims who took this at face value were being truer to the text. And then that leaves us with having to look at this as a supernatural event, the kind of thing that we don't see today. Now, this next verse is one about Jesus and his miracles. And I won't read the whole thing, but the section I've put in bold, and I cure the blind and the leper, and I give life to the dead. Again, you'll have some modernist apologetics today saying, look, this is curing the spiritually blind, giving the spiritually dead spiritual life. But for most of Islam's history, you won't see that kind of exegesis or tafsir. You'll see it as more literal. And these kinds of challenges or disputes rage on today. Now, if you do take it literally, then some of you might be familiar with this graph that illustrates God's power. Now, it's meant to be a bit of a facetious meme, so I encourage you all, wherever you are in the belief spectrum, keep an open mind with me here. But what it's trying to demonstrate is that we have scripture and stories from religions, not just Islam, from a long time ago, who've talked about miracles that sound really fantastical, supernatural. And over time, the extent or the power of those miracles has diminished. And so now, in modern day, for example, you'll see people seeing holy personages in their toast or carved into the side of the tree, whereas in the past, we had Jesus raising the dead and healing the blind and so forth. So how we interpret this stuff really matters. And if we interpret this stuff literally, then it falls in the face of what we know about the real world.